Welcome to another session of Less with Gene and James. Today, the topic of discussion is the definition of done, how that influences organizational design and team design, and vice versa. I am James Carpenter, one of the certified LeSS trainers here in the U.S. I'm currently based in Milwaukee, and I'm accompanied on the call by Gene Gendel, who is my wonderful peer that I have based in New York. Gene, do you want to start off the discussion?
Sure. Thank you, James. The definition of done. Well, first I would like to mention something that will probably give an aha moment to many organizations that are very interested in having maturity metrics defined and strictly followed. Well, think of your definition of done maturity of it as one of the best indicators of your overall team and organizational maturity. Not in so many words, the more inclusive your definition of done is, the more mature you are as a team. The more inclusive your definition of done is, if it spans across multiple teams. For example, if you have multiple teams working on the same product, out of the same backlog for the same product owner, then the more your entire product group is mature. So of course there are other numerical values that you can collect and chase and escalate up the chain of command. But frankly speaking, your definition of done, along with such things as cycle time, cost of transaction, cost of holding, cost of shipment, those are probably much more effective and better metrics to collect. Now, as I mentioned before, definition of done is something that, I made this as an implicit comment. If you have a large product that has multiple teams working on the same product at the same time, of course, they would have to have a shared definition of done by virtue of having the same product. So the lowest common denominator should be there. And the more inclusive it is, the better off we are, the more mature we are as a product group. Now, let's just say you cannot make your definition of done very inclusive, and you come to the end of sprint. Whether it's one team or multiple teams, it doesn't really matter. But you come to the end of sprint, and there's so much more for you to finish to do before you can even go to production. Well, by the way, we call this entire spectrum of work as undone work, and it usually gets passed on to the undone department. And the organizations may call it differently. DevOps team, integration team, coordination team, deployment team, some other XYZ. We are taking care of all of your undone work team. That spectrum of work essentially is an indicator of your low maturity. So the bigger it is, the wider it is, the less mature you are as a team. And of course, if you have multiple teams, then we can think of a larger organizational size that is also less mature. So your definition of done could be a very powerful mechanism to gauge, to measure your overall maturity of a team or multiple teams in agile product development, or adaptive product development, as we prefer calling it rather than agile, because agile is a very beat up term. So I think a definition of done is a very good thing to keep on the radar, and teams and organizations should really take this seriously. So the wider it is, the more inclusive it is, the better off you are, the more mature you are. Make sure your CIO and CTO and the CTOs understand this, know this, and probably stop chasing velocities, because that's like a third degree of variance, a third degree of importance. What do you think, James? What are your thoughts on the same?
Thank you, Gene. I agree with everything you said. So I'll just add to it. First off, I find that I think it is important to mention the multiple teams working on the same code base. You brought that up. If they're touching the same code and they don't have the same definition of done, then there will be conflict that just doesn't need to happen. You will have one team that is exhibiting a super high quality standard, and the other team that is doing lackluster quality, and there's constantly going to be tension there. because they're really not focused on the same things. They're not aligned. They don't have common goals. And I think that's one of the many reasons that it is so important to have a single definition of done for a single product. Another thing that I think is underappreciated is that the definition of done can be used as a ratcheting tool to constantly improve your quality. As an example, one of my favorite lines on a definition of done is any new or modified code. Automated unit tests have been written for any new or modified code, including positive and negative test cases, including language X, language Y, and language Z that are in use within the product. So that if you touch the code, you have to leave it better, a Boy Scout rule. But if that code calls another class, as long as you don't have to touch that other class, although you are empowered to go fix that as well if you need to, you absolutely have to agree to fix the scope that you agreed on. And so you're constantly making the system better than you found it, and your quality is slowly improving. And in the same way, one of the things you can do is you can have a product backlog item that you work on within a sprint, and that when that is done, the definition of done goes from not having, let's say, static code analysis to this PBI put static code analysis in place and then ratcheted the definition of done so that that would always be there. So these kinds of things can be used as a tool. I'm also a big fan of non-hand-wavy definitions of done. So I like it to be kind of specific, kind of like what you said. And again, to be a collaborative effort by all of the team members to have, created that definition of done collaboratively. That's really all I have, Gene.
Yeah, quick question. So you actually sparked one interesting thought in my mind, and I this is how I usually formulate this to my coaches, trainees, and just colleagues. Definition of done isn't something that should remain static.
Not at all.
The goal is to, of course, and you mentioned this also, by improving with every sprint, with every iteration. Definition of done maturity may improve over time by expanding it naturally, like stretching it. It may not be 100% ever, and your undone may never become null, zero, but the aspiration should be to expand your definition of done over time so that it's more inclusive. Would you?
Yeah, I would agree. I would say if your definition of done never seems to change, then either A, you're not improving, or B, just as likely, no one's paying attention to it. Both are bad, and both may be true.
What are some of your thoughts? Like, how would you? What's the best way to normalize to find the lowest common denominator amongst more than one team, obviously 2+ teams, to formulate at least some bare bones shared definition of done? What are some of the basic techniques or
what I have found? So again, being such a fan of really being concrete as your line items with very little hand waving. One of my favorites is to have multiple definitions of done from different example context. I have some in my book for that very reason. Pardon me. And then put them on the wall, have the teams walk past them and read them and decide which line items they want. They indicate the ones they want. They write on a sticky note new ones or variations thereof. So you're effectively doing dot voting using existing definitions of done to kind of get you seated. And you're also brainstorming new line items. And then once you do that initial brainstorming / dot voting, then you come and the group slowly goes through it and bakes it down to something that they're all happy with. My experience is that can usually take, if you have multiple teams, that could take half a day to a day of work to really make a good one. If you had a small team, they'd work together a long time, they're all, solid agilists, they may knock one out real fast. But what I have seen in scale is it usually takes quite a bit of effort to come up with a really good one to start with. And then you just iteratively make it better over time.
Got it. So interesting turn I would like to make in our conversation. This is something that I always like doing. Let's quickly discuss this very concept of the definition of done in the scope of organizational design structure and team structure and dynamics. On so many occasions, I have seen a limited definition of done being defined by the current team structure. And as we know, majority of organizations out there, like large banks, pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, they have component teams, application teams, platform teams, shared services teams. I do only one thing type of work teams. And of course, for those teams, definition of done is by virtue being, them being focused on very, 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 small body of work are very limited. So it is interesting. It's almost it's painful. So if you want to define your product widely, and of course have teams that are true product teams that work across an entire stack of your product features, then of course you would like each team to have a pretty wide product definition of done. But then of course if you repurpose, you reutilize existing organizational structure without challenging it, without changing team structure and going into cross-functional feature teams, aka product teams, then it becomes a friction, because those teams by definition cannot have a widely defined, broader definition of done. So what are your observations on
I
that?
completely agree. You can look at the definition of, assuming the definition of done is actually being paid attention to, which usually the contract game is in play and it's not, because people are in a rock and a hard place, and what happens is they cut on the thing that people can't see and then they don't talk about it. But if it's real and people actually pay attention to it, you can tell how healthy the team is to some extent just by how good their definition of done is. Does it actually go all the way to production? And, in a low absorption cost world, every time you check in code, it potentially goes all the way to production.
We just blew the gasket on the majority of companies trying to assess their team's level of maturity, which I think by virtue of setting levels or layers or pecking orders, it's a huge anomaly to me. But quite frankly, if your teams have a weak definition of done and it does not improve over sprints, over months, why are we even talking about teams' maturity? What signifies teams' maturity better than their ability to get closer to production line? Well, I don't know. Feel free to comment. But
no, it's so much of a team's success is they're set up to succeed or fail before they write the first line of code. And one of the things you do in LeSS adoption is people self-organize into truly cross-functional, cross-component feature teams, where each team is able to, take work all the way to production while still collaborating with their sister teams. But more, that's really not about, each team is still independently able to deliver. And so,
or at least try to get closer to production line, and try to improve that, shorten that distance with every sprint.
And the discussions that happen, to some extent, the definition of done, especially an initial definition of done, is the outcome of an extended discussion. It's not. It is the consensus that is important more than the particulars that are written on the page to some extent.
Got it.
So anyway, we may need to wrap.
Yeah, well, that was a great quick chat. I appreciate you stepping out and calling me for this. Let's iterate more.
Sounds good.
On the same or something else. Well, great seeing you.
Gene, it's a privilege. I continue to put comments in our on the video and let us know what you'd like us to discuss next.
Absolutely. Let us know.
Thanks again.